Greetings, Imaginarians. This week I got another great conversation with Nick Iafrate again, and we're talking about the biological theory of the psyche again. We're talking about the genome this time. We're asking the question, what is innate about the psyche? What does the psyche know innately, just as part of being human? So sit back, enjoy, and we hope you get something out of it.
There we go. Dr. Goodwin, it's good to see you again, sir.
Great to be back.
For all those folks listening, Dr. Goodwin and I have been kind of spitballing what we want to talk about going forward. And we both agreed that it's most likely best that we start at a foundational level and maybe build from there. And I really kind of want to know what Dr. Goodwin is doing with his work right now. So yeah, we wanted to talk about biology and proof therein of the collective unconscious.
Yeah. So lately I've been working on this. There's been discussion about the biological side of archetypes in the collective unconscious for a while. And a lot of it has to do with the evolutionary information or the theory of evolution and the new stuff that's emerged since Jung died about the genome and how evolution works and all of that sort of stuff. And there's, as you may or may not know, there's a cadre of thinkers who have applied that stuff to Jung and said, okay, he proposed this thing called the collective unconscious, and we think that there's a way that you can show that is that can be based in biological knowledge that we now have. And then there's another group or camp that says that the new information that we've acquired since Jung died actually falsifies the idea of the collective unconscious as he wrote it. So I have been very involved with this conversation for, I guess, 10 years now. And it's just absolutely fascinating to me, because when I first heard about the collective unconscious, I was coming at it from the point of view of a resident in after I had graduated medical school. I was a psychiatric resident. I was very steeped in the biological sciences, and my background was physics and math, so I was really into that stuff. And Jung's ideas just captured my imagination. But as I read it, I'm like, this feels right, but is it right? I don't know, and I was just really, I don't want to say disturbed by that, but I mean, it just really piqued my curiosity. And as I read his work and just gobble it up, I thought there's got to be a way to show whether or not this is true. So that's when I bumped into the work of Anthony Stevens and John Huell and those guys, George Hoganson, and they have all done a ton of the groundwork for this. And they're amongst, they don't always agree with each other, but they are all definitely coming at that from that point of view and saying, yeah, there's a biological basis for this. There's a way to show that Jung was right. So, but then around late 90s, 2000, I won't say that Jean Knox was the first person to object to that treatment, but she was the one who put forth her own theory that was based on developmental psychology data, and also she very seriously took the new information that we were gathering about the genome and said, well, not really. And her argument was that at the time we thought the genome was around 30,000 genes, and she thought that wasn't enough to really give us a full-blooded collective unconscious like Jung envisioned, that is just loaded with content and capable of conjuring up stuff that you've never seen before based on our biological history. But that wasn't her only objection, because honestly, if you ask me, that's a really weak objection, because we don't know how many genes it takes to do much of anything. And we do know that a small handful of genes can combine in almost an infinite number of ways to create all kinds of things. So that was kind of flimsy.
What is that? Yeah, why isn't that enough for her?
How much is enough?
Right, exactly.
No one ever answered that question. Right. It was my first question when I came across her work. I was like, this is really good, but I don't understand this point here. What do you mean 30,000 is not enough? I mean, I can kind of see that, because now, to be fair, the gene count had been dwindling for several years. So that was kind of interesting, because originally when we were looking at the human genome, we thought, oh, there's 100,000 genes on that. But then as we went on and on and on and on, and they kept finding that more and more of this so-called junk DNA, and they realized, okay, but fewer and fewer and fewer, the estimate kept going down of actually coding segments of the genome. And that went down, it kept dwindling down to, I think it went even further, like 25,000 or something like that. So I think from Knox's point of view, she was becoming more and more disillusioned with the idea as the number dwindled. But it's just a number. There's no sense of what that number actually means.
Right.
And you have to be really careful with genetics and biology in general, because biology will do everything that you think it can't do. It's like, what is that guy in Jurassic Park, right? Life finds a way. That's very true. And you could just never, like lobsters have more DNA than humans do. So what does that mean?
Right.
I have no idea. It's certainly not a one-to-one, like more genes means more intelligence. No, that doesn't work. I mean, we share a huge percentage of our genetic material with watermelons. So what is that all about? So anyway, that seemed to be a sticking point for her, but that wasn't the end of it, the story for her. I think the real meat and potatoes of her argument against there being a strong biological component or genetic component to the collective unconscious was based more on studies of infants and how she gives the example of something called the Conspect Mechanism. So an newborn infant has a couple of orientational biases towards human faces. And what happens is they tend to look at faces more. And well, why would that be? Well, because human faces are really important to other humans, because we're social. And so from that interaction, the other person is there, and they develop from there. New things emerge in their psyche that are related to this growing, I guess, function of connecting with other human beings. So, and she's very well versed in attachment theory and used a lot of that in her analysis. So, as the argument goes, the newborn is only equipped with these orientational biases. It's the interaction with the caretakers and that basic, very basic framework from the infant that causes the emergence of attachments and all of the meaning that goes into the image of the other and all of that stuff. And so from her perspective, now I don't argue with any of that, that's all true. But it's her interpretation that I object to from there, because she goes from there to therefore, it means that the genome only has this little tiny contribution and the environment does everything else. So there can't be any way of correctly arguing that the genome encodes symbolic information involving mothers or fathers or the anima or any of that stuff that Jung talked about. Now, at first glance, when I first came across this, it's a very persuasive argument. And I don't even know, yeah, I don't know how you're feeling about hearing this now. You're like, well, yeah, it kind of sounds like, maybe she's right.
No, no, not at all.
Okay, all right, you're too smart for that. I wasn't that smart when I first read it. When I first read it, I thought, well, that sounds logical. But the more I thought about it, the more I was kind of scratching my head. I'm like, there's something about this that doesn't make sense. Well, fast forward 10 years, and I've written a bunch of stuff about this, and this new paper I'm working on. I should be able to present this at the next IAAP or IAPP conference. This is going to be next year in Buenos Aires. So that's my plan anyway. But the point of it is that you've got the idea that the genome gives us stuff that is present at birth. And then after that, if something new is emergent from there, we can't say that it's encoded by the genome because there's environmental influence. That doesn't work. No. And the reason why is there's hidden in there a false dichotomy of learned versus innate, as if there's everything is either one or the other, and that's it. There's no blending. There's no nothing. There's no such thing as genetically guided learning, which we all know is a fact now, and all that stuff, right? So the problem with that interpretation, I think, hinges on the idea that emergence means it's not innate. So if something new emerges in development, then it's not innate. That sounds logical on the surface, but if you pursue it at all, you'll realize it doesn't make much sense because, let's start off at the zygote, right?
Yeah.
The moment of conception, you've got a single cell and a genome.
Right.
Everything else that happens is emergent.
Yeah.
Because of the interaction between the genome and the zygote and the environment of the womb.
Right.
You've got organs, you've got, all that.
Yeah, it's missing. It's completely missing any type of insight into, or ignoring maybe lifespan development. Puberty, for instance, came to mind for me. Just like, these hormones present themselves at a certain point in age that is completely, it's not dependent on environmental factors. It can be influenced as such, but these things happen, right? Whether or not we'd like it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. That was exactly the example I gave. Secondary sex characteristics are emergent. They show up much later than birth, obviously. They serve a very obvious function because, sexual reproduction is kind of important for us to still be here, and it doesn't have much to do with the environment. It's not that it's immune to the environment, of course. Like you said, there are plenty of studies that can show all the different things that can potentially influence the onset of menarche, say. And some really interesting ones out there, like father attachment can affect the age at which a young woman starts menarche. They seem to be connected anyway. I'm not sure if they've figured out the causal connection there, but there's a correlation. So that's interesting. Of course, nutrition naturally can make a huge difference. Okay, but it's only specific things in the environment that can affect it. It's not just bloody anything, right? The price of tea in China does not affect the onset of menarche, So what's up with that? So I think that the important thing about that is that the genome is still the arbitrator of how this progresses. And the fact that it has environmental built-in flexibility should not dissuade us from thinking that it's still innate.
Right.
And again, the problem with this is, what does innate mean? And if, in my opinion, it means that it does not involve learning. It's something that emerges. So it can be emergent. In fact, pretty much everything is, so it might as well be. But it's not emergent in a way that is dependent on something specifically different happening to you. So the ability to play Rachmaninoff's third is most definitely dependent on environmental input, However, like you said, secondary sex characteristics, not so much. There's things that can influence it a little bit, but it's not anywhere near as dependent on it as the development of a specific skill or a cultural expression like the piano, piece. So it turns out you have a spectrum, really. You have a spectrum of developmental trajectories. On one end, you have stuff that emerges no matter what happens. Basic organ structure, the skeleton, the development of organ differentiation and all that stuff's emergent, but it doesn't have much to do with anything going on psychologically in the environment. It can have things to do with, like, if your mother gets a virus, that can affect the way things progress.
Right.
Duh. But to say that means the genome doesn't encode for that, that's a problem. The other problem with her interpretation there is that it hinges on presence at birth. And as we just gave the example of something that emerges much later than birth, I mean, that you could go on and on and on and just go by examples like that. Presence at birth is completely arbitrary. Because, well, what about stuff that developed before birth? Right? There's certainly environmental things that can happen that can flub that up. And by the same token, after you're born, things can develop along a genetically guided trajectory that have very little to do with your psychological environment.
Right.
But for Knox, apparently presence at birth is it. If it's not present at birth, it's not innate. And that's a classic mistake that sometimes people make. And I think it just doesn't account for the rich complexity of how development happens, and the way the genome is just ingenious in the way that it does what it does.
Yep.
And I'm personifying it a little bit, but I think it's warranted because there are definitely things that happen that it's as if the genome thought it out ahead of time.
Right.
Right. So a good example, another one I use for this is learning how to walk. We've talked about this before, I think. Now, learning to walk is a skill that develops after birth, right? You can't do it when you're born. And yet everything in the whole human body physiologically is organized around the fact that you will be. So like the curvature of the spine is different in bipeds versus quadrupeds. The different way that the veins have valves in them at different levels. The way the blood pressure system is monitored up here, right? If you're going to monitor blood pressure, you need to do it up high, right? You could do it down here, right? But what would that really do for your head? Well, it doesn't matter if you're vertical or if you're horizontal, right? Because the blood pressure is going to be pretty much the same all around, right? So now there may be other reasons why it developed like that, but that's why it persisted in a bipedal organism, So the structure of the spinal reflexes are different. In an upright walking, they have to be.
Right.
Reflexes are there to stabilize you, keep you from falling over, because if you fall over, you're vulnerable and you're going to get killed by the tiger, right? The ubiquitous tiger that's always in these stories, lurking in the shadows. But so is it just some kind of magical coincidence that the whole body is organized around the fact that you will walk? No, of course not. It's designed to do that, right? And I have to be careful when I use words like that because it implies teleology, and some people really recoil aghast and clutch the pearls over that sort of thing. And I'm not so offended by the idea of teleological development. I think that's not a big deal. We're just talking about function, and we do it all the time in evolution anyway, so we might as well just own it. So we're talking about function. Function is development proceeding in accordance to a specific goal. It's a final cause in Aristotelian terms. So we might as well be okay with that. Yeah. And that's what's going on. The genome expects that you will be able to walk, that you will teach yourself how to do it, because it's organized everything else outside of the brain around that idea. Right? So that is another reason why you can't say that, well, there's this little tiny reflexive structure at birth called the Conspect mechanism, but beyond that, the genome doesn't contribute anything. Baloney.
Yeah.
No way.
Yeah.
It's so pervasively affecting everything else that could contribute to that one skill that we happen to be talking about. But there's another reason why you could say that that's wrong. So the objection that the genome is not sufficient to encode symbolic information. Let's go back to that for a second. Let's forget the fact that We don't know how many genes it really takes. Let's just say the genome just can't encode symbolic information. What do I got to do to disprove that? Give one example, right? Easy. Facial expressions. Well, facial expression, and the thing about this is that we just take it for granted. We don't notice it. That is a symbol. An angry face is a symbol of emotions, of rageful emotions. It could be anything under the sun, and it's not a frown or a scowl.
Right.
A smile symbolizes happy feelings. How does this magically develop? It develops in people who are born blind.
Exactly. I was just going to use that example.
Yeah, it's a great example. And I do this all the time. I talk about stuff that develops in people, people that are born blind. And say, okay, where's the learning here? Yeah, there's emergence, there's development, there's environmental input. That's all there, duh. But is it learning? Okay, so that's the other factor here. Not all environmental input should be classified as learning. Now, all learning is certainly environmental input. But if, say, we're talking about nutrition affecting the onset of menarche, that's environmental input. That's not learning.
Right.
All right, the knee-jerk reflex. If I tap the knee and it shoots out, well, that's environmental influence.
Yeah.
That's not learning. It's just built into the system.
Right.
From day one. So that kind of stuff, combined with the fact that facial expressions is a clear example of symbols that emerge in the psyche that have practically nothing to do with learning. Because otherwise a person who is born blind would have no facial expressions.
Right.
But there's a lot of reasons to suggest why no, that is definitely not the way that evolution would do this, because all you gotta do is look at the animal kingdom. And so if we're going to be biological, we need to make sure that we remember that humans are not the only animals around.
Right.
And animals communicate in all kinds of different ways. Communication, I can't think of anything beyond like single cellular. Even single cellular organisms communicate with chemical signals and all that kind of stuff. It's a thing that biology does, communicate. Now humans, I think because we are so good at communication in terms of verbal, like complex information, we forget all the other ways that we communicate. And most of it is, under the radar. And we learn this in therapy, as I know you've studied. You learn to read body language and tone and all that kind of stuff. And sometimes it's just sort of a gestalt. It's a feel. And you're getting something from it and you're not sure what.
Right.
But all of that stuff is communication that has very little to do with like exactly what they're saying. In fact, I can say, oh, sure, yeah. And that I mean the opposite of what I just said.
Right.
How does that work? But the point is that that facial expressions, you can see animals doing the same sorts of things with each other. And I think that the smile, ironically, evolved from threat displays. Isn't that funny? Now, when Jung then says there's something very serious in every joke, and I also then hear on the other side that smiles probably evolved from threat displays from other animals, I'm like, oh, okay. So, yeah, smile can represent happiness, but there might be a little undercurrent in there.
Yeah.
Of, dominance, or whatever it is, who knows? But the point is that if a random culture is separated from the world in history and they grow up on Mars, say, they're going to have facial expressions in their cultural expressions because it's biological. It's fully biological. Upright posture and walking is going to be a part of their symbols. And it's all the stuff that everybody kind of takes for granted that gets woven into that. So if we look at the collective unconscious as the grand sum total of all the archetypes, and that is one way to look at it. There's a bunch of different ways to look at it, but let's just look at the biology of it.
I was going to say, so we know that there's the innate.
Yes.
Right.
Yes.
And I can already hear people saying, okay, in terms of how they interpret the collective unconscious and what that means.
Yes.
there might be this argument. Well, okay, so we know that there are these innate things, this information, right? That is it's communicated genetically, right, from generation to generation, and it's not only hereditary in terms of familial lines, but also the human species, and I would argue the animal kingdom,
Absolutely.
everything, right?
Well, almost every animal uses the same genetic code, even though there's no reason why it needs to be that way.
Right.
So the code came about super early. It's all part of our heritage. And I would argue that the genome is a physical carrier of ancestral memory. Now, that's a loaded statement to say. But if it's capable of creating emergent products that are nevertheless innate and based on your species history rather than your own personal history, then what else would be, what else would qualify for an ancestral memory but that?
Right.
Yeah. But anyway, I interrupted you. Where are you?
No. So let's let this be where we take a stand, right? In terms of we will keep it with biology. But I want to clarify for those listening that if they think we're going to dive into the biological proof that you have an inner Achilles, that isn't necessarily going to happen.
Absolutely
right.
not.
Okay.
No.
Yeah.
Right. Because that's the straw man that Jung always got, attacked.
Right.
Oh, you're saying that everyone has Zeus in their head. No, not at all. But we do inherit a significant amount of structure, and I think most of it is in the form of tendencies and cognitive biases that organize in very complex ways towards particular images. And the way that Jung puts it later on in his career, I think, is really clean and very nice. He said that the theory of the theory of archetypes is really nothing more than just saying that we all are born with a tendency to create the kind of images you see in catalogs of world symbolism. That's all he's saying. It doesn't mean you'll always have it. He's saying it's a tendency. And that's allowed, right? It's a dispositional characteristic. Totally fine. So then it helps you to explain why you have thunder gods all over the world, but they don't have to be the same thunder god, And I think we can even take that a little bit further. And so this is, I think, probably the reason why Jung made this distinction between the archetypal image and the archetype as such. And I understand why he did it that way, because he was steeped in Kant and Immanuel Kant's philosophy, and as some philosophers have written about, that he kind of muddled it up a little bit in his attempt to try to apply that same differentiation that Kant makes between the thing and the thing in itself, and apply it to his theory. And I don't know that was the best way to go, because of, number one, when you do that, you invite all of this commentary on Kant, which is completely irrelevant, honestly, because he was just using it as an analogy. But two, it implies that there's this one-to-one relationship. Like there's this structure in the psyche that is the archetype as such of, say, the mother goddess, and that experience fills in the gaps and creates a mother goddess image. And that sounds reasonable on the surface until, again, you start getting into the weeds with, well, where is this archetype as such then? What is it exactly? How does it? And I think an easier way to do that is to say, okay, we got archetypal images, but we don't inherit a mother goddess template that is waiting for experience to fill in,
right?
Like an empty cup that you're waiting to pour.
A coloring book.
Yeah. It's not like that. Instead, what we inherit is, in my opinion, and what I argue, is that we inherit an alphabet of archetypal elements. They're pieces. They're symbols in the true sense of the word, and the fact, meaning that they take a concrete, physical, visual, spatial representation of either an image or a story, and map it to an emotional subjective experience,
Mm.
facial expression, maps the smile with happy feelings. They are not identical. It's a symbol, and it's a specific kind of symbol. It's an indexical symbol, and it indicates there's so Jung talks about signs and symbols when he writes about this. He says signs are not what I'm getting at. A sign is like a stop sign.
Right.
It's a red octagon that means stop. There's no mystery to it. That's not what he's getting at. He's getting at, in his phraseology, a symbol is an image for which there is nothing better to express the thing that it is expressing, right? It's a really roundabout way of just getting at it. But, it's kind of like the Madonna and child image is an expression of the mother-infant bond.
Mm.
And it's difficult to do much better than the image, right? You can't boil it down any further. It can't be reduced to anything else. That's the essence of a symbol in Jung's terminology, as I read him. So that doesn't quite match up with how semioticians describe symbols, but it's good enough, I think. But semioticians make this more a finer distinction between a sign, which is the same as what Jung talks about, and an indexical symbol. There's also an iconic symbol. Mm. An iconic symbol would be, like, say, a picture of a snake. Okay, a picture of a snake is not a snake. It's still a symbol. Not in Jung's usage, though, in the semiotician's usage, right? So this is where it gets a little tricky. But there's no deeper mystery to it. It's not indicating anything else. It's just that. However, the caduceus, which is the twin snakes climbing up the staff of Hermes Trismegistus, well, that's a symbol because it means way more than just snakes. And you can always tell because it has snakes doing stuff that they never really do, right? They don't twirl around each other like such, and then look at each other perfect. They don't do that in real life, whatever real life is. So obviously this is representative of something deeper. So that's an indexical symbol. So I think that a smile is a representation of something that's deeper. It's happy feelings. And there's really no better way to express that than a smile. Right? You can try to what I'm saying? You can try to reduce it down to, a bunch of stuff, but at the end of the day, it's that. And it's a very basic symbol. It's nothing as mysterious as the mandala, say.
Right.
But there's a biological reason for its existence, and there's an innate basis for the symbolism there. So I think what we do is we inherit this alphabet of those kinds of symbolic associations, and that from them the psyche, for its reasons, will combine them in different ways to create archetypal images. It'll take your experience and it'll arrange it into an archetypal image. And you can tell that it's an archetypal image versus a non-archetypal image by how many of those archetypal elements are part of it. Okay, so if you dream about, so we're frequently using this stuff to decode dreams. So let's just go with that, right? I have a dream about winning the lottery, and we're talking about currency. I think we talked about this before.
Yeah.
So currency being a representation of social status and worthiness, or even mental energy, happens a lot in dreams. I see that symbol used frequently. More often than not, it's somebody who, say, is depressed and some other character is stealing all their money. And so it's a symbol of whatever that other character is representing, draining away their status, their sense of worth, blah, blah, blah. That's not an archetypal association. It's not an archetypal element, because there's no innate reason why we should link green pieces of paper with that. Okay. However, a dream about going into a dark cave or the dark, mysterious forest is using light symbolism. That is innate. Light being representative of safety and knowledge and all that kind of stuff. So that's how I can parse out between what is this dream an archetypal image? And one of the reviewers on some of the papers I've been working on pointed out that they can be dynamic, and I'm like, of course, but Jung used the word archetypal image, okay, and an image suggests a static, photo,
Right.
It's a picture. No, that's not what he meant. It can be dynamic. A story
Exactly.
can be an archetypal image. Absolutely. So just keeping that in mind, that the idea of the going down into the cave and finding the fire within, or the fire in the water, or whatever it is, those are all archetypal because anybody could have used that symbolism because of the archetypal elements that we all inherit, that link fire with intense affect, passion, sex, rage. That's an archetypal image. Heat, and the reason for that is because when we have those emotions, our temperature goes up, literally.
Right.
And so anybody, anywhere, because of the fact that you happen to be Homo sapiens living in a terrestrial environment, is going to emerge as a tool that your psyche can then use to create symbols. So when someone comes along and they have a dream, I can look for those different associations. And if I see enough of them that are archetypal in nature, that are innate, I know that their dream is without a doubt an archetypal image. I don't have to guess. So I think there's strength in this approach. And I feel like the advantage of it is the ability to not have to argue the point with people about how this is, because everything under the sun gets labeled an archetype if you read enough of this stuff.
Right.
And that frustrates me to no end, because everything cannot be an archetype. It's ridiculous. What are we talking about here? The conceptual imprecision muddies the water to the point where nobody knows what an archetype is anymore anyway, and that's a problem. It's a big problem. And it's not something I uniquely have recognized, as people have been grumbling about this for years. And it's number one would be the critiques of Jung. People that think Jung is a mystic and a kook. It's like, well, look at all the way that all these Jungians talk about archetypes being potentially anything under the sun. It's like, okay, but they're trying to get at the kernel of the idea that he was looking for. But if we don't figure out some way to differentiate them, we're not going to get anywhere. So this is my way of doing that. Now, does that mean that I'm leaving some things out? Yeah, probably. But we got to start somewhere. There could be things like, looking at archetypes as metaphysical entities that exist within the fabric of the universe and all that. That depends on your philosophy of mind and your metaphysics. I don't think that's mutually exclusive with what I'm talking about. But Jung started with biology, so that's what we're going to do.
Yeah. Well, I mean, and then Jung also said that the archetypes, and if talking about it biologically, were the self-portrait, right, of instincts, right, and that this is, this is something that I've worked on extensively, and this is something that that we've talked about extensively. But if we are strictly speaking biologically, and these instinctual pressures are happening, and then they have these representations in the social environment, they are at that point innate tendencies towards the narrative of the archetype.
Yeah. Yes, it helps. It pushes you in many different subtle ways towards development of a particular archetypal image that, because you understand the pressures behind it, you can see why it gets repeated across the globe. And in mathematics and complexity theory, they call those sorts of things attractor points in a complex dynamic system far from equilibrium. You can get feedback loops and all sorts of complex interactions that will eventually settle upon a particular state. That's an attractor state. And an attractor state is a very interesting thing, because it's called that because it's often independent of initial conditions, right? Which is exactly what we're talking about here. It doesn't matter where you're from or who you are or what your personal history is. There's a natural tendency to be drawn towards the same kinds of images over and over again. And I think all I'm doing is I'm mapping out what the pressures are. What are the constraints and biases on cognition and emotion. You know, I don't know exactly when the connection between light and knowledge and safety develops, but I'm betting it's pretty early. Now, does a newborn infant do that? Probably not, because they probably don't have that much cognitive activity going on. But I don't care, because I don't have to use presence at birth as my, innate condition. If it emerges later, but I can show that it's independent of learning, it's still innate. And it has to be, now here's the gray area about learning. I think we've talked about this a little bit, is that not all learning is created equal. So some learning you're going to do no matter what, because you just like walking, you're going to teach yourself how to walk. And it's just based on trial and error. And if you watch infants, they learn to grasp things. And I don't think they're doing it because they're watching other people grasp things. It's just you stick anything in front of them, they're going to reach out towards it and try to get it. And usually if they can get it, they'll stick it in their mouth. And that's just what they do, And so, but they're learning when they're doing this. They're learning kinesthetic feedback and how to control their limbs and all this. It's the same way they learn language. They first start babbling. They'll go blah, 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 blah. And every time they hear that, there's a connection made in the brain, I think, between the sound and the configuration of the mouth and the pharynx and all that produce that sound. See, so that's why they babble. Is they're teaching themselves the connection between the physiology of the mouth and the pharynx and the sound, and they do that constantly. As if you've been around infants, they'll do this. But after a while, they can start to hear other people making those sounds, and then they can repeat them. So they'll just repeat anything they hear. And they just do this because a tendency to do that leads naturally to the development of a language. So it doesn't necessarily mean that the genome has, and this is one of the things I think people object to, is that when we talk about something being encoded by the genome, it doesn't mean that there's a blueprint in the genome somewhere, with it mapped out exactly. No, it's more like a trajectory. It says, go this direction. And lo and behold, you'll find what you need. And that's more what happens. Yeah. It feels, I guess on a certain level, it must feel kind of accidental to people studying this, that it happens that way. But it can't be. Obviously, it's not, because all of the trajectories that didn't lead to that endpoint that's super necessary, like being able to walk and talk, died out. Yeah. So the genome will have all of these different fail safes and redundancies in place so that no matter what, I learn a language. And if you have twins, oftentimes people observe twins talking to each other and they start developing their own language. If you let them go and don't expose them to any other languages, they would most likely just develop their own. And who knows what they would be talking about? I don't know. But because they're so close in age, and they're so close together physically, and they're doing their thing, they're babbling, and their brain is absorbing all this the whole time. Now, to say that's not genetically encoded then is to say that it's just an accident that everybody learns a language. No. Give me a break. No way. Now, it is certainly fair to say that we don't have a genetic encoding to learn English, right? Despite what some people might think out there. But a language, yeah, because if we did that, everybody would speak the exact same language. Right. But there's like 6,000 languages in the world. So that isn't the case. However, you can take people, I think when Europeans first encountered, I'm probably botching this, but I thought it was Tanzania or someplace in that region of the world, they encountered for the first people who had not encountered anyone else for like 50,000 years because they'd been separated for so long. And they picked up the language like that. But obviously they had their own language. But then they were able to communicate in the other language quickly and easily. So that's pretty cool. That's pretty interesting. So, I mean, there's definitely a strong pressure to, hey, brain, learn a language, do it. And I don't need someone to come along and tell me. Now, I do need someone to come along and tell me how to read and write. We're not just genetically set up to do that because we don't need it. We didn't need it, at least for the first 99% of our existence.
Yeah.
So that's what genetic encoding means. It means so much more than just creating a structure that's present at birth. So it's no wonder that Knox and people that have read and been influenced by her work have thought that there's no way that science supports the idea of a collective unconscious, because they're just thinking of it the wrong way, the way that, and frankly a way that geneticists and biologists do not think of it. They don't think of it that way.
Right. Well, in people other fields, primatology, ethnology.
Yeah, absolutely.
Cultural
I just know the
anthropology.
genetic side of it because that's where I'm coming from. I did genetic research. I was on the bench for a couple of years.
You're talking about something that is, I mean, I'm getting this image of a compass, right? That it is going to guide you in a certain direction, and it's going to find whatever the most optimal route for adaptation is going to be, and then go from there, and then go from there, and then go from there, and really help the human individual progress, right? And accomplish these necessary genetic adaptations to accomplish further necessary genetic adaptations or adaptations in general throughout lifespan development. That's one thing. And then the second thing would be that if it weren't the case, right? If it weren't the case that we had this innate information that was embedded in the genome that expresses itself through instinct, i.e. emotion, and then also narrative, archetypal, if it wasn't the case, then if there wasn't some structure forming cosmos, biologic, right, biologos, then it would just be all entropy. Everything would fall apart.
Right. Well, the classic question here for evolutionary scientists has been, in terms of humans, is, I forget which one of them, it was a famous one that posed the question. What we're really asking here is if we were to take a group of people and stick them on Mars and they would be completely separate, would they develop a culture that looks like the cultures around the world? Because everyone always assumes that the culture is the way it is because they were just taught that.
Right.
And what culture then is thought of as pretty much arbitrary. But that doesn't make much sense. Because there's all these biological pressures. And the way you describe that as a compass, I really like that, because the genome in no way stops influencing us at birth.
Right.
After birth, the genome is continually active, and it remains that way all the way up to death. And there's plenty of examples of this occurring in the literature of how one of the examples I give is a brain-derived neurotrophic factor, BDNF. Have we talked about that here?
No, not yet.
No? Okay. So BDNF is a hormone that in utero, it stimulates neural growth. And obviously there needs to be a lot of that going on in utero, because we got this biological imperative to create this ginormous brain, because that's how we survive. However, it does other stuff later in life. It doesn't just disappear once the brain is formed, because the brain doesn't just stop forming, right? That's another thing that people need to get out of their heads. That idea is probably around because the dreaded computer metaphor of the brain.
Right.
The mind works just like a computer. No, it does not work like a computer. Thank God it doesn't. But never mind that. That's a rabbit hole. I don't want to go down there. No, but so BDNF is there in utero, and it's there later in life during adolescence, where there's another huge explosion in neural growth. Now, with each of these neural growths, there's also big pruning periods, right? There's this back and forth. Because the brain, I think in biology, it's just easier. Let's just create a whole bunch of this stuff, and then we'll get rid of the stuff that we don't need later, rather than something more specific, right? Nature just takes the path that works. Doesn't matter how logical it looks from the outside. Okay, but that's how it works. But then it also is sensitive to a number of different things happening in your life. Like if you are exercising, it'll bump up. If you are working on mental puzzles, the working on mental puzzles stimulates the increase of BDNF in the brain. Psychotherapy increases it. And we don't know exactly what triggers, like what are the triggers for the cascade down into the genome and shift epigenetic modification to crank out more BDNF, but we do know that it does do this. So there's something about those things triggering the increase in BDNF that then therefore promotes growth and increase in learning and stuff like that. And it probably has to do with environmental pressures. When they're high, then the human genome will say, okay, we've got to step up our game.
Right.
Crank out some BDNF,
Mhm.
and get her done.
Yeah.
But in times of relative, like plenty, you don't have to work that hard. It's okay to let it slide a little bit, and your brain can just sort of dumb down, and it's okay. Right, because nature is efficient. Nature is, it does not care if you are on your A game 24 hours a day.
Does not waste energy.
Never. No, because energy is so precious.
Mm-hmm.
And the brain is a massive energy hog. It just sucks up the energy. So it was a huge gamble on the, in proto-humans to say, let's double down on that brain stuff.
Right.
Let's do it again and again and again. And you had this, in human evolution, you had this massive explosion of the brain cavity at multiple points.
Mm-hmm.
It worked. Obviously, we're here talking about it, so it worked. But it's always a trade-off. It's always a trade-off. So there's mechanisms in place that are present throughout life that manage this. And they have nothing to do with your individual human history. It has everything to do with your genome working the way it's supposed to,
right?
Selected to. So now what you're really talking about then is, I'm going through life, I run into an event, say, it triggers a response not from my memory of my past, childhood, but from the genome. The genome responds and says, here you go. This is what you need to be thinking about now. That is a very powerful distinction. If you can figure it out, that means you can tell when your patient is sitting in front of you, or even you yourself, are experiencing something that is derived ultimately from your own personal history or from the history of the human race. It's kind of important distinction, I think. And I think this is why you have the differentiation between mundane dreams and the big dreams that Jung talks about. The big dreams, they feel like they're out of nowhere. They contain symbolism that is mystifying sometimes to interpreters. And you're like, what? And then where did that come from? He said, that's a dead giveaway.
Yeah.
This is why, because it's independent of our personal history. And there are Jungians out there who have argued that the archetypes and the collective unconscious are really just reflections of early history and early development. And this is why I disagree with them on that. And there's no doubt in my mind that those things are extremely important. Absolutely. Absolutely. And sometimes it's easy to get carried away with the innate side and forget about the personal side.
Right.
Because any dream or vision, or even just a reverie and a revelation, inspiration, whatever, is going to contain a combination of this stuff. Because again, the brain is going to use what it's got to get across what it needs. Right. So when you are having thoughts like this, like you have it, the dreams are a great example, because they are, in some ways, they're just pure expressions of your current life situation.
Right.
And the same kind of things, principles that influence dream construction, influence things like memory too, meaning that emotional stuff stays, and the brain, the mind is always kind of cranking out this personal narrative, like, where am I in life? What is my purpose? What am I doing? And that's your memory. But dreams say, okay, let's take that up a notch and say, it's like this. It's a symbol. I'm going to symbolize your life now. Because that extra piece is absolutely critical. Why? Well, because the symbol is able to do things that a list of things that have happened to you can't do. And it's using the power of symbolism to do so. But in a mundane dream, it's only going to take stuff that's happened to you personally to create those symbols. And those associations that are going to be in those images are going to be non-archetypal ones, like the money, say. Or another example I gave was someone had a dream of an egg. Well, an egg is oftentimes used as a symbol of rebirth and rejuvenation and potential and all that kind of stuff. But I don't think it's an archetypal symbol, because you have to, if you were raised in a world where there aren't any eggs, you would never make that association. Now, it's an easy association to make, so maybe it's like a cultural symbol. It's at that in-between level there. But now, that's not to say, however, that the sphere doesn't lend itself to the images and symbolism of the egg, because it does. Because a sphere is an archetypal symbol. It's a shape, it's perfectly symmetrical in all three dimensions, and the association between symmetry and conceptual harmony is a symbol that is archetypal. That's where the mandala stuff comes from. And that, again, comes from our physiology. We are, as human beings, we are concerned about, actually, the equation of symmetry with fitness is something that runs through multiple species. Any species that has bilateral symmetry, like humans, is going to be cued in on that, making sure the symmetry is actually there. If there's asymmetry, there's going to be a preference against that, because it's a sign of health and fitness that you have symmetry. Okay, so that already that's there. That's already there. That's pre-human. Bees do this. Okay, so bees have a preference for symmetrical, bodies and even like faces, which is bizarre to me. But I was reading that, I was like, why do they care? But it probably just has to do with this preference for symmetry. Now, couple that with the fact that we're upright, walking, bipedal organisms, and symmetry takes on another meaning. It means out of balance is bad, and imbalance is good. It doesn't take a unique poetic genius to come up with this stuff and spread it across the land, right? Or anybody is going to come up with that association and use it in their images. So if you have a dream that is almost completely composed of these archetypal symbols, then that's, or these archetypal elements rather, then that is an archetypal image. You can just guarantee it. And another dead giveaway too is that it uses the stuff that has happened to you, your personal life experiences, in a way that you have never done so. So the example I give is there's a dream of a patient I had who came into therapy and had this dream that was loaded with alchemical symbolism. And it was using like an exercise machine, but in a way that no exercise machine ever works. It was this great big black egg-shaped thing that she got into and was turned. It was dark in there and she was turning, and it was, the heat was increasing and all that stuff. That's alchemy right there. You've got the vessel, it's black. You put the Negredo in there, you turn it, you heat it up. It's classic. It's classic. Right. But you could look at that and go, well, exercise machines can't be archetypal. And I say, that's not what I'm looking at. I'm looking at how it's used. How's it used? Yeah, you're right. They aren't. But the equation of the egg and all that stuff, again, we talk about the egg being non-archetypal, but the sphere is. And so I think if you combine it with the symbol and the turning and the heat and the improvement of the self, right? Bam. She had no knowledge of alchemical symbolism. It's a great reason for it to use it, because so many people don't know anything about it. And that way, you know what you're dealing with as soon as it shows up. It's like, well, they probably didn't read that anywhere. But then, there's no exercise machines that function that way. And there's got to be a reason for that. There's a reason that it was depicted that way. And it's to serve the symbolic meaning of the dream, which is you're getting ready to go into therapy and it's as if you're about to go through this ordeal.
The transformation.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly. And it was with her sister too, which is another fun thing, because the alchemicals treatises often talk about the Sora Mystica that's with the alchemist. And in this paper, I do note, however, though, that the physical actual sister being there is notable as a non-archetypal element. It should have been a Sora Mystica. It should have been a spiritual sister, if you were going to match it up perfectly. So there's a reason then that she dreamed about her actual sister going through this. And I learned later in therapy why that was. It was that they were very close, very connected. And so her development was tied to her sister's and vice versa. But I never would have thought of that if I hadn't been looking at dreams like this.
Right.
And it turned out to be hugely important in her improvement and her sister's. I've never met her sister, but she's gotten better too. And when she shared this dream with me, I said, you know, both of you are going through therapy now, whether you like it or not, or whether I like it or not. This is what the psyche is informing me of.
Right.
That's
Right.
the great thing about all this, is that once you recognize the collective unconscious is real, it's the third player in the drama that comes into the room with you, and you've got one, and they've got one,
Right.
and they start communicating and talking. And if you're not aware of it, it's all going on in the background. Well, that's not ideal.
There's always 4 people in the room,
Mm.
right? If there's 2 people in the room, there's always 4.
Right. The window.
Yeah.
Right? Yeah.
Well, there's actually a slight synchronicity. I think we talked about this the first time we actually spoke. I had a coaching client who had a very alchemical dream. But as you're talking about dreams, and as you're talking about this patient, I typically present to people. I actually did it recently. Just a group of friends I was speaking to, and one of them was adamant that, you know, there was a significant amount of disbelief, right? That the instincts, archetypes, or just the unconscious in general existed. And I asked them, and I present everybody with this question that usually, you know, kind of presents to me this disagreement. I say, if everything were to go to just absolute crap, right? If the very fabric and structure of society were to go, what's the first thing you would do? Right. And as we began talking and we kind of presenting more context to the conversation, they said, well, I would want shelter. I would want to build some sort of a safety structure. I would want some way to defend myself, and I would want some way to feed myself. And I said, have you chosen those things, or are those things a necessity? And in that situation, in the situation that you're presented in, that external trauma, right? You are now presented with a set of impulses to navigate that environment, right? And I would argue that if somebody were to be presented a situation as such, something like that, their dreams, their unconscious would present some of the most probably very significantly packed imagery, symbolic imagery and information.
Oh yeah. I agree with that. Because those are the moments when the genome needs to step up,
right,
and do its job,
right,
which is help you survive so that it can perpetuate itself.
right.
Yeah, and that, I mean, so
cortisol, adrenaline, all that stuff is going up, and there's no control over that whatsoever, right? No. And that is one of the biggest arguments I make. I said, listen, you came up with that yourself, right? But is it yourself? Is that it? You know that you need shelter, right? You know that you need some way to protect yourself. You know that you need some way to feed yourself. And those are all very foundational drives to the human instinctual experience. And then I typically add another layer to that. I say, okay, let's say you've developed all that. Let's say you do have a structure around you. You have walls that you've built in order to protect yourself from entropy, from the chaos of the external environment. Really, it's a different kind of cosmos out there, right? It's more or less just consistent stressful interaction. So let's say you've developed this. There are 3 strangers that are knocking on your door that want to get in there. What do you do? Right? Well, what do you need? What is the context of the situation? So again, I present this kind of this situation, this scenario. But it is very interesting to see those answers, because I would say 99.9% of the time I ask somebody that, it's usually those top 3: security and shelter, protection, and food, right? Those top 3 are usually right there in different varying orders.
Right. It's not, I need to make sure I update my Netflix subscription.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
Nothing like that. No. It's basic. Yeah. I can hear the counter argument to that would probably be something along the lines of, you learned that you need all that stuff, you know, which is malarkey to me, because it's like, okay, so you're telling me that if nobody told me I needed to do that stuff, I would just be laying there helpless, completely bewildered, and have no idea what to do. Well, come on. Well,
in modernity, and you brought up how nature doesn't waste energy, right? Yeah. So right now, presently, I think that we would have to, if everything were to kind of disintegrate and we would have to go out and do things, I would say that that are instinctually embedded within us. It's not like we're going to the supermarket to survive anymore, right? We have to go out and try to kill potentially something in order to eat. And I think that's a whole different ball game when you talk about instincts and the collective unconscious.
Well, yeah, and the influence of culture is extremely important, of course, because we are, again, it's not that this excludes the genome. The genome says you need to seek out and develop your culture, whatever it is, find your tribe. And that's the other thing people would do. They would gravitate towards each other like that.
Yep.
And we live in a society now that's resources are relatively abundant. I mean, we've got these billionaires flying up into space, right? And all that. But it's, you know, relatively safe for the most part, you know, except in particular areas. So we don't normally have to think about this kind of stuff.
Right.
So we think it isn't there. But the moment the danger happens, it kicks in. I think that stuff will kick in, and those are genomic responses. They don't have anything to do with your. Now, does that mean that you wouldn't have a whole lot of trouble hunting? Oh, absolutely, because hunting is hard. And our distant ancestors would hunt megafauna with pointed sticks and rocks. I mean, that takes some skill, and it took them years to learn how to do it, most likely. But nevertheless, you know you got it, right? And you would figure it out. You would figure it out. It would be very painful, I think. Yeah. You know, because the culture is expected by the genome, and if it isn't there, it's like a fish out of water for a while. You know, so culture definitely impacts the genome too, and we haven't talked much about that. Maybe we should when we get to the cultural system and how it ties back in to the psychological and the biological,
right?
Because it absolutely does. And we also haven't talked about some other stuff like epigenetic modification of the genome and how the events that happened to me can actually affect my grandchildren. And that's some newer stuff that's out there that's really wild. But you know, that's just another layer, you know.
That's in part 2, guys. Part 2.
Yeah, part 2. Tune in next time. Same bat channel.
All right, Dr. G. Well, Dr. Goodwin, this was great conversation today, as always. And guys, yeah, part 2, I definitely think we should dive into the epigenetics, and we'll be continuing it therein. Keep it going.
Cool. See you then.
All right. See you then.